good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever time of day people are listening. I always want to start that way, but then it feels strange because people are probably not listening on the same time of day.
That's right.
But I am Hannah Longley. I'm the Clinical Director of Advocacy and Crisis Intervention with NAMI Maine, and you are here with the Danger of Silence podcast, and we have a special guest.
Hi,
if you'd like to
Hannah.
introduce yourself.
Hi, Hannah. I am Chris McLaughlin. I'm a licensed clinical social worker here in Maine, and I wear a couple different hats. I am the Executive Director of the Maine Chapter of the National Association of Social Workers, and I'm the owner of a consulting group here in Maine, Inspired Consulting Group, where we do some behavioral health, leadership, and diversity, equity, and inclusion consultation.
And you have other hats too, but I am not going to spoil that because you have been prepared. And again, all of our
That's right.
3 loyal listeners know that we end with our fun facts, so I don't want to ruin any of your fun facts.
I'm keeping my facts close to my chest for the next half hour or so.
You have to, and then that way I actually don't really pick mine out until I hear what whoever I'm with has said, and then I'm like, I want to do one that is as cool as whatever.
Well, you have
they
more
do.
pressure because you do all these episodes, so you have to come up with new ones where I'm just coming in as a first timer, hopefully not a last time, but a first time.
No,
today.
I mean, we're alrey planning your reoccurring episodes.
That's right.
We have another reoccurring character on our podcast for all of you who are excited. But yeah, I'm also really boring, so that is part of what
I know that's not true already.
Yeah, well, we'll see when it comes to fun facts. I'm already getting nervous knowing what all of yours potentially are going to be. So we are here, though. I asked you to come here because we've had a lot of discussions in the community about compassion fatigue, about burnout, about moral injury, which are all 3 very separate things, but sometimes can be intermingled.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that we are a profession as social workers. We're a profession where I think we're really great at talking to other people about it. I will admit we're horrible at actually
100%
practicing it from time to time and taking care of it and those precautions. But I had someone recently say that as a social worker in our ethics, I mean, we have really significant ethics in our profession. But someone tell me that self-care and monitoring all of this and being mindful of all of this for myself and not just for others is an ethical obligation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the Code of Ethics for our profession, which is an NASW product, which is pretty universally recognized. Here in Maine, our Board of Social Work Licensure has actually adopted that Code of Ethics. And this whole idea of self-care and the role self-care has in our ability to practice ethically and competently is sort of a new-ish phenomenon, but one that I think is getting often overlooked.
Yeah. And I think that's something that's really important to bring to light because, again, we are fantastic at telling everyone else, hey, be mindful of this. These are things. This is how you take care of yourself. And
Yeah, Hannah, from my perspective, one of the maybe silver linings of the pandemic has been this increased attention to burnout and self-care. But you and I know, having been doing this work for decades now, this has always been really an essential component of our profession. And it took this global pandemic for us to really make room to talk about it in a more focused and I think intentional way.
Yes.
And I'm hopeful that now 4 years beyond the pandemic, we can still keep that energy up and talking about it.
And the continuation of it. One of the big things is, as I was saying, joking before, is I don't usually do a ton of preparatory work for our episodes, but I really wanted to make sure that we were able to differentiate between the differences of compassion fatigue, of burnout. And then, it's a newer concept. It's been around since the Vietnam War, since our veterans came home from the Vietnam War, but we're really starting to recognize it more globally in other populations, but moral injury.
Yeah.
And so I actually wrote down definitions, which I was so proud of myself
Yeah,
that I took that preparation.
Well, I think to your point, it's so important that we get clarity because they are different. And the idea of compassion fatigue in our profession is different than what burnout might look like, both for social workers and folks in other industries or fields.
Exactly. So I'm going to start with compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is a traumatic stress syndrome that affects people who deal with others' pain, stress, or trauma. Compassion fatigue is marked by emotional and physical exhaustion, decreased empathy, negative emotions, and feelings of helplessness. It can affect professions who support people who are suffering, such as doctors, therapists, or disaster relief workers. So that's pretty, I feel like in a lot of these too, we go to the extremes of like a disaster relief worker. Those are pretty extreme circumstances, but you can see that in so many different aspects in so many different professions too.
Yeah, I think the part of the definition that resonates with me is really that idea of anyone who is sitting in the pain of another person. And so you don't have to be in these real extreme roles like a surgeon or a disaster relief worker to be sitting in that pain of somebody else. We see this in our work with case managers, with in-home support staff, with educators, teachers, who are often sitting in the pain of the kids, youth, students around them.
Yeah. I think one of the most beautiful, and I'm going to butcher it horrifically right now, but one of the most beautiful summaries, just an acknowledgement of it, was that there are a lot of professions where in order to be able to respond to these situations that are heartbreaking, that are difficult, that's sitting with other people's emotions and able to be fully present and be able to support that individual, oftentimes we have to turn off our own reactions and responses and emotions. Right. And it can start to be difficult if we turn it off a whole bunch to be present for someone else. How do we start to turn it back on? How do we start to have those normal emotions and reactions in those extreme situations?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I wish I had like a real succinct $1 million answer for you. Because I know, thinking back around my own social work career, there have been times I couldn't turn it off, let alone get it back on again when I needed to. This is not a profession where you punch in and punch out and leave everything nicely on your desk and go home and spend time with family and loved ones and pets to tackle it fresh the next morning. So much of this work follows us. And I found during the pandemic when my commute was removed because we weren't traveling anymore. We weren't going into offices anymore. And all of my work was being done virtually. Even that 15, 20-minute ride home, I missed that. And my commute became leaving my office on the second floor and walking down to the kitchen living room on the first floor. And 3.9 seconds of a commute was not enough. And so that was one of my strategies, is actually getting out, walking around the house, getting outside, moving my body to simulate what that commute home might have brought me as I was kind of shedding the stuff from the day.
I've had a similar experience. My kids go to school 5 minutes from my office. Yeah. And so I have maybe 5 minutes after I drop them off, and I have maybe 5 minutes when I pick them up, and then we have all of that drive. I think one of the greatest things my husband has ever done for me is when he recognizes that I'm having compassion fatigue, where I just either can't turn my emotions off or I'm struggling with turning them back on and regulating that. He has to drive out of his way about a half an hour, but he's like, I'm going to get the kids for you. Yeah. Take the drive, sit outside, do whatever you need to do just to have that ability to self-regulate. And I say that I talk to other working parents who struggle the same way with that. Yeah. And it's very similar. Everyone noticed it during the pandemic, but a lot of us have recognized it continuing since then. And so really making sure that we have that. Because it's how do you turn it off? How do you turn it back on? How do you regulate it appropriately?
Yeah. Well, most of us, I'm going to make a paint with a very broad stroke here. Folks in these professions are often folks who say, like myself, I didn't choose this work chose me. And so knowing you the way I know you, we are empaths naturally. We are the folks that find ourselves in checkout lines at grocery stores and convenience stores all over all over the place, and people just stop and tell us their stuff. Like there's something that we radiate, something in our energy that invites, tell me your stuff. And so as empaths, we have to navigate this work and this world with a different set of guardrails, I think, than folks in other professions have to use.
Oh, I love that. I really love that. And I think even outside of this profession, there are so many folks that are just drawn to their work because they naturally just want to help others. And they are compassionate, empathetic people. And then just how depleting, and I think that validating for some people, it can be depleting to be empathetic, to, be in it, there and present for others.
That's right. Yeah. The resources that work takes, you are on. I remember my direct clinical days going back some time in my career. Like that client needs you to be on and reflecting back and providing that support and guidance and validation and recommendations and everything that therapy can be for folks. And to do that hour after hour after hour and seeing 7, 8 or more clients a day, there are times I think back, like I really pity those clients that were in the end of my schedule on some of those days, because it takes an incredible amount of internal and external resources to stay on and stay in that pain that somebody is sharing with you.
I like that you clarified it, stay in, because that's really, I have to lean in and I have to sit in with you. And that's a lot.
It is a lot. It absolutely is a lot.
And so I think that's why we're seeing, and I just want, we have a whole group of folks that end up listening to this. As much as I joke, we have 3 viewers. I hope we have more than that. I do think from some of the feedback we get, we have more than that. And there's a lot of folks that are in professions that we wouldn't necessarily think of as struggling and having to sit in someone else's pain. I mean, I think about hairdressers, stylists.
Yeah,
all of that.
Folks who become the go-to for a community or for a customer base, and they hear it all. And those folks aren't getting the same obvious training that we get as social workers or clinicians or therapists. The resources this takes is incredible.
And I think naming it sometimes is just helpful too. And going back to, in the interest of recognizing that Devin oftentimes ends up cutting us off for time. So I want to make sure that we're cognizant of that. But, as we're talking about how exhausting it is, people oftentimes, we get the term of du jour, as you will. And so people talk a lot about compassion fatigue. And then prior to that, I think a lot of people were talking about burnout. And so clarifying the differences between it is that burnout is a state of emotional, mental, and often physical exhaustion, is a pervasive condition that can be triggered by prolonged and repeated stress. While it's commonly associated with work-related issues, it can also permeate other aspects of life, including parenting, caretaking, or even romantic relationships. This comprehensive reach underscores the importance of addressing burnout in all its forms.
Yeah. So I do a lot in my consultative role. I do a lot of work with organizations and individuals on kind of what's the difference with burnout and compassion fatigue, and what are the signs and symptoms and things to watch out for. And I often talk about burnout as really our relationship to the employment. It's the relationship that we have with our colleagues, our peers, our coworkers, our boss. And it's that, that frustration, that day in, day out, that starts gnawing at us. So when I think about burnout, I think about the folks, myself included, who might find ourselves saying, I wish I got more appreciation. I need more supervision. I wish we had better parking. I wish the vending machines gave cooler candy. I wish I made more money. I wish my schedule would that relationship to our employer, to the work. Then contrasting that with compassion fatigue, it's less about the location and the people, and it's more about our relationship to the energy that we are giving and receiving. And so burnout is something that is universal, I think, to your point in that definition. It can be employment-based, it can be interpersonal-based, and burnout got really a lot of attention through the 60s with, and you could hear this like in the songs that were happening at that time in the 60s. People were talking about this relationship to work and the man. And around that time, there was research happening in Stanford with the famous Stanford prison experiments, and this term was starting to get coined. And then here on the East Coast in New York, burnout was also being researched and developed in a very different model, in more helping professions, in thinking about our work as therapists and medical providers and our relationship to the employment, to the work, to the job, to the site. And I think it's fascinating that over the last several decades, we've been able to carve these two pieces out, separating burnout from this, I think, this higher risk idea of compassion fatigue, because I think the interventions to help mitigate both of those things also looks different. If I'm frustrated with my coworker bringing Thai food to the office every day and the smell is starting to get to me, or I don't feel like I make enough money, or I wish I had cooler parking, or whatever the issue is, there might be some remedies for that, like a new job. Well, in compassion fatigue, switching the employment, the job, isn't going to be the cure, because it's my relationship to what I'm doing, not where I'm doing it or who I'm doing it with.
Oh, I love that. I'm going to back up a little bit. One of the things I try and talk a lot about is that we make assumptions of baseline knowledge or baseline skills in a lot of different avenues. And you referenced the Stanford prison. I know, I'm very familiar with it. I feel like anyone who's, done psychology, for those who don't know and might be like, how do I look this up? What does that mean? What is that? Do a quick little blip on that?
Yeah, so in a very quick nutshell, Stanford prison experiments obviously happening in California, and related to the experiment was related to our reaction to authority and punishment, and what the implications of being the receiver or the giver of discipline, and ideas of social hierarchies and structure. But what they found is that in those experiments, when folks were in the guard role, this authority, this power that folks were in, and even though it was completely role playing and fictionalized for the purpose of this went to folks' head. And so part of what this work, these experiments discovered, was the human capacity to do harm, especially when we are told it is our job to do this. You are to push this button. You are to do this to that person. What the folks participating in some of the experiment didn't know was that who they thought they were punishing were actors or actresses and were performing. But the impact that had on the button pushers, the literal folks who were issuing a punishment, thinking they might be doing harm, or they were doing harm to the prisoners in this experiment, a lot of research has come from that we're still, I think, 50, 60 years later digging through.
Yeah. And it's, that's what I always find fascinating. And that's what I always get concerned about with like buzzwords or terms that come out, is I'm like, these have been around for a long time. It's not necessarily a new phenomena. It's the buzzword of the day or the discussion of the day, and really, kind of moving forward. But it is, to me, it's always so fascinating to see how those roles that are almost imposed on us, despite the fact that many of us, I've wanted to be a social worker since I was 11, but those roles that are kind of defined for us, how much it can dictate and kind of change us.
Yeah. Yeah, for better or worse.
Yeah.
For better or worse. And so burnout is one of those terms that kind of started emerging from these experiments. And folks might be familiar with the Maslach burnout inventory. Maslach was one of the researchers connected to this, and her inventory, I use it in some of my work and trainings as well, which is a instrument that you can self-administer that looks at, am I burnt out? Am I compassion fatigued? Sort of starting to peel back some of the layers of what the symptoms that we see in folks who are struggling with these syndromes.
Yeah. So I, like many of us in this profession, really only get phone calls when someone is really struggling, and it's never a good day for them. You know, some of the big things that I have folks reach out to me about are like decision making, having to make choices, remembering to stop at the store and get milk, like these really small life events that we kind of take for granted. I always joke about it, and I'm like, adulting is so hard because it's so many decisions. Like every night I have to pick out what we're going to have for dinner, and we're going to have to make it and all of that. And these really small moments where they start to come out and they really start to manifest in people's personal lives.
Yeah. So one of my experience with burnout through the pandemic was that decision fatigue that I think you're referencing, and making decisions all day long, which is not unlike the job before March of 2020, but there was a different flavor to that, and the pace, and not giving myself time or space to process what I was needing as a human through this really stressful time in our lives. And I would get home, and by getting home, I mean walking from the second floor to the first. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was what's for dinner tonight, or what are we going to watch tonight, or what am I going to wear tomorrow? Is my laundry done? And so the early phases of the pandemic was when my husband and I got into meal planning. And that is something 4 years later we still do. Every Sunday, we know, to the annoyance of some in our lives, like we know who's home on what nights and what the meal is, and that's what we grocery shop for on Sundays. But it was a way that we could mitigate the decision fatigue, because it was for both of us. He works in healthcare. He's in marketing and communications at a large healthcare system here in our state. And so the last thing he wanted to do after being charged with communicating the decisions, and often being frontline of folks' reaction to some of those decisions. He's also the cook in our house. The last thing he wanted to deal with was, what are we going to do for dinner? Yeah. We have nothing here. And remember what going to the grocery store was like back in 2020 and even 2021. And so, yeah, I think as humans and as providers, we find these tricks to manage and get around some of the symptoms.
So I will admit, I miss grocery stores during COVID. They were so organized and structured, and they were such a good flow.
So many choices,
And to me, that is one of the things that I miss. I miss most about COVID. I literally will go to the grocery store and be standing in line and be like, I miss it. Yeah. I just miss it. They move people through so quickly.
That's right. They're efficient places.
Yes. I know I'm struggling. This is a really funny way, but I know I'm struggling with all of that is when I love to read. And when I can't pick out a book and I start getting overwhelmed with I can't decide what book I'm going to, which is a really... for me, it's a really funny. I kind of laugh at myself and I'm like, okay, Hannah, this is your self-care, but this is also like...
But it's funny when those flags start popping up. Yeah, Hannah, one of the things that I don't think we talk about enough is this idea that the symptoms of burnout and some of the symptoms of compassion fatigue mirror depression.
Yeah.
And so when we think about what is good self-care, when we are feeling those lower moments of our mood and feeling depressed, some of those interventions that we might need reminders from others to do, of course, are some of the same interventions for things like burnout.
Yeah, absolutely. I was able to select a book recently, and it was quite interesting, and I wanted to look up what it was and I completely forgot, but it was in reading it, it talked about willpower essentially being a muscle that we can only use it for so long. We only have that willpower for so long, and then it just gets tired.
Fatigued.
Yeah. Which I found really fascinating as I was kind of doing some preparation for this and stuff, and how it led into that is that there is decision-making fatigue. There is willpower fatigue. These are all muscles. We think of muscles and our muscle fatigue, like I can only lift so much before I'm going to get too tired, or I can only walk so far. But all of those are, they're not muscles, but they're things that can really start to wear out.
Yeah, and what I love about the muscle analogy is there's fatigue, but there's also cramps, right? And so when we experience fatigue, we might just put it aside and can't do it anymore. But when we experience a cramp, it hurts and it's painful. And that requires a different level of intervention as well. So when my self-care muscles are cramping, look out, both for myself and everyone around me.
Absolutely. So we have those. One of the newer, and when I'm working with someone, I kind of break it down a little bit more and further, but one of the newer other, I'd say, buzzwords, but again, it's been around for a while, is moral injury.
Yeah.
And I think that sadly we saw it, the term came out, Vietnam War veterans came home, they were being treated for symptoms of post-traumatic stress injury, and those symptoms were becoming mitigated, those physiological responses, but they were still experiencing these acute emotional reactions and responses and reflection. And that's really when they started paying attention to the moral foundation. So moral injury is a social, psychological, and spiritual harm that arises from a betrayal of one's core values, such as justice, fairness, and loyalty, which is pretty profound when you think about it. And again, we started noticing it with our Vietnam War veterans, and then expanding it out. First responders is one that, we know have a high rate of moral injury as well. But in talking and interacting with so many people in helping professions, really a lot of what they describe goes back to moral injury and seeing that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a sadly fascinating but important topic. If burnout is like depression, then compassion fatigue, moral injury, and what's sometimes called vicarious or secondary trauma is like PTSD. And so that ability to be triggered inadvertently by something very benign. So, in my household, it might be a really stressful work time, and then we're out of dog food. Something so benign that happens, like we didn't get to the dog food store this week, can put us in a full-fledged panic. And so I think that's one of my internal barometers of how we check in with ourselves and then with our loved ones and one another. What are those sort of temperature points that we can be alerted by someone or to ourselves that we're crossing into a different threshold? And maybe it's the threshold of a moral injury.
Absolutely. I think I always say technology is really great until it isn't.
Yeah, right.
And really, we were having a conversation beforehand, for anyone who really cares for the context, about the trivia night. I love trivia. One, I'm super competitive and I just always want to win.
Yeah.
But I love trivia, particularly history. And so I really find it fascinating kind of looking back at the awareness of mental health. Historically, I'm fascinated with the historical aspects of it. I'm also, the more I talk to folks about moral injury or even administrative betrayal, is another one that, I hear about a lot that goes into the burnout aspect of things. But technology is really I'd say for most of the community, technology really is interlaced with the moral injury in some aspects of it, in my opinion.
Yeah.
You can completely disagree. Just in terms of, we have this view of the world.
Yeah.
And the more we're exposed to it and bombarded with all of the horrors everywhere in the world, as opposed to just our little corner of Maine, you know, you really start to see the impact and how heavy it can become on folks.
Yeah.
And I say that also on developing braids as a mom of a teenager and a preteen. You can really see the heavy impacts of just the constant bombardment of information
100%.
and negativity and stuff.
You and I could spend all afternoon talking. Like, this is 4 more podcast episodes, right? Like, it is not coincidental to me that with the rise of smartphones, we also see a rise of depression and anxiety, especially in young people. Like, that's not a coincidence for me. And the research that points to the younger a child is when they start carrying the mini computers in their pockets, and that constant, I love that word, bombardment, because that really is what it feels like. We are exposing that young person to some of these behavioral health concerns earlier and earlier and earlier. When families or parents reach out to me and say, okay, Chris, what is your favorite piece of advice to give a parent? I say, put off the cell phone for as long as possible. And if the cell phone is a requirement for whatever reason, what are the guardrails around that? It does not go in kids' bedroom at night. It's not this constant scroll. It's educating oneself on the different parental control aspects of it. How do you lock it down? It's a privilege, not an entitlement, like all of that stuff around cell phones. But even as an adult, I find myself as an empath very susceptible to the tough stuff happening in our world.
Yeah.
And that was one of the first things I did during the pandemic, is I got off all of it. I no longer felt this urge or need to scroll. What do the kids call it? The doom scrolling, of just like soaking, marinating in the hard stuff of our world. And that's not to like turn a blind eye to it. Like, I think you can I'm somebody that believes in holding sometimes 2 things at the same time as often as possible. So I can care deeply about the wellness of the world and of populations within our world, and step out of that marinade from time to time and give myself a break from it.
My oldest is in high school now, and he does a fantastic job of, after years of training, of recognizing he'll put stops on it and he'll take breaks on his own now, because we had a lot of conversations of, I always love you, but when you're on it too much, I don't always like you. You are a different person. Yeah. And he's able to recognize that. But it starts as you have to hold those 2 truths. I think that introducing information in age appropriate ways with those coping skills. Yeah. 6th grade, they do a lot of environmental studies. He came home crying one day. Oh, he's going to hate me that I'm saying that. He's not that anyone, he's going to listen to this. Yeah. But, the world's going to end. All these environmental studies talking about, climate change and all of that. And I was like, oh, baby, like, how do we match that? And so we actually, in holding those 2 truths, we make sure our kids have an idea of what's going on in the world. But I don't even always let them watch the news at this point, because of the moral injury, like just the foundational belief system of everything that's wrong in the world. And it can, for empaths, it can become overwhelming with, how do I address this?
It's boundaries. What you're talking about is boundaries, and what we know as providers is boundaries. And that is probably one of the number one thing I say to folks who are struggling with compassion fatigue or burnout. It's boundaries. What are the boundaries you set to the workplace, in your personal life? And the better we get with boundaries, I anecdotally have found, the more resilient we can be with some of the symptoms of burnout and compassion fatigue.
So as we're running out of time, we're not going to miss our fun fact in case you were thinking that you were going to get out of that. Parting advice, parting thoughts, as we've kind of broken down all of the different aspects of it. What are things that we can do to take care of ourselves, to again, meet that ethical obligation of self-care that I don't think it's just a professional. Every human being has an ethical obligation of self-care.
Yeah. I think my favorite analogy of burnout and compassion fatigue is the whole idea of a river and riverbeds eroding. And so the erosion of the riverbeds is not an intentional act from the river. It's just a consequence. It's a side effect of the river doing what the river has always done for centuries. And so if we start treating our wellness like the riverbed and acknowledge that the work is the work and the work is just flowing like work will always flow, what are some of the precautions that we might take if we were charged with caring for the riverbed, preventing erosion? And then how do we apply that as a metaphor or analogy to our own wellness? So by paying attention to what the river is doing, being mindful of where we see erosion starting, and then how do we shore up those aspects of erosion? Some of it's self-care, some of it's boundaries, some of it's asking for help. We sometimes just don't have the ability to care for the riverbed by ourselves, and we need a team of folks to come in and help us kind of rebuild where things have drifted off. That metaphor charges me forward as I start thinking about not just my own wellness, but the wellness of those I care about and working with.
I love that so much.
You can borrow it anytime.
I was gonna say,
it's yours, free of charge.
Well, see, I always say the first 3 to 5 times that I use something that I really love from someone else, I'm going to give you direct credit. But then I've used it 3 to 5 times, and so
you've adopted it.
Yeah, so I've incorporated it. I'll tweak it a little bit.
Right.
So it's more Hannah than Chris. But...
My royalty charges are very low at this point, so have at it.
All right, perfect. I appreciate that. Any parting thoughts on the subject before we go into our fun facts and wrap up?
No, just thanks for the invite to being here. It's really great to connect with you and others in the studio around things that we are passionate about.
And again, we're very excited for the next episode. You will have to stay tuned because it is going to be a super fun episode that I will be completely cut out of, except for from behind the camera, but that is fine. All right, so fun fact.
So my fun fact is maybe a little bit of a teaser of what might be to come, is that anybody that knows me knows that I am a loyal Swiftie, and I just love talking about the way that Taylor Swift has influenced not just her industry, but all of our industries and lives, and that there are some, lover or hater, there are some lessons that we can take from Taylor and what she's taught us about empowerment and in the diversity, equity, inclusion world and leadership. And so my fun fact is I love applying Taylorisms to my everyday life and my professional life.
I wonder if there's any way we could possibly ever convince her to come to Maine and join a podcast or even call in.
There is not, but
come on.
I'm not going to yuck the yum. I know that Taylor's got a lot going on right now, but that doesn't stop me from trying. I tag her in all of my posts.
She is, again, as a mom of a girl mom, I love her. I love her on so many levels, but I just love her as a role model.
Absolutely.
For my daughter.
Oh my gosh, absolutely.
And for my son too. He would never, he puts on his very but
there's a by proxy effect with this Taylor stuff too, that I think men, boys, teens have a lot we can learn about how we treat those we love and care about, and how we make room for the marginalized or the oppressed at our tables, whatever those tables are.
Yes, and I love the way he passively challenges kind of the status quo and all of that, but just very, does it as only a teenage boy can do.
That's right. Yeah.
So, I will go along with that. I'm not as much of a Swiftie as everyone in this room is. But music, when we talk about self-care, we talk about, how do we take care of ourselves? Music is huge in my house as it relates to coping skills. So we actually have a Spotify account specifically that everyone has their playlist.
Oh, that's cool.
My kids actually made a playlist for me, like, when you're having a bad day, Mom, here are songs we know you like, and all of that. So we use that as a tool to really practice self-care and have, everyone talks about meditation, and I have a lot of folks who are like, I just can't meditate. I'm like, music is meditative.
That's right.
And to use it in that aspect.
I love that. That's good to know about you.
Yeah, so I guess that'll be my fun fact. And on that note, I think we're coming to a conclusion. I think this has been a little bit of a longer episode, and hopefully people hung in there and enjoyed it. And I'm so excited to at least record and hear the next episode when you reoccur. And as always, we hope that you took something away and you have a fantastic day, evening, morning.
All of it.
All of it. All of it.
Thanks again, Hannah.
Thank
Great being
you.
with you.